Oh, well, I think the best part was when we landed in San Felipe, we were the one of the only planes there. I have four kids and I was traveling with three of them. And my daughter, she's the little miniature CEO of the family. And so she goes into the immigration desk and she starts asking questions and she speaks Spanish as well. So the immigration officer actually let her get behind the desk and do the passport stamps, which that's not something you'd ever see in the US. It was pretty cool. She sat in a chair and was stamping all the passports and doing all that. So that was a really nice moment that sort of showed the warmth of the Mexican people, even in the government office. And that's one of the reasons I love going down to Mexico.
That's Brian Deere talking about one of the pleasures of flying in Mexico. And in a moment, he'll tell you what you need to do to fly a plane from the U.S. to Mexico and back. Hello again, and welcome to Aviation News Talk, a weekly show with relevant news and flying tips for pilots and student pilots to help keep you safe. I'm Max Truscott. By the way, this week, I'm doing a lot of flying around the country in Vision Jets with multiple clients, and I'm posting a lot of Vision Jet videos and photos on Instagram. So if you're on Instagram, follow me at Aviation News Talk, which is all one word. And if you're thinking about someday buying a Cirrus or SF-50 Vision Jet, there's a lot I can help you with. So please call me today at 650-967-2500 for a free consultation and possibly a free demo flight. Now, last week in episode 134, we talked about how to avoid CFIT or controlled flight into terrain accidents. So if you missed that episode, you may want to check it out. And if you feel like you're getting value from our shows, well, become an awesome supporter today. Please make a small donation through our Patreon page by going to aviationnewstalk.com/awesome. And when you do, I'll read your name on the show. Now let's talk about flying in Mexico. Now, this is a topic I'm passionate about because back in the 1990s, I was president for 2 years of Los Médicos Voladores, or Flying Doctors, which is a group that flies volunteer doctors and dentists to Mexico on 4-day trips where they give care to people in underserved areas, and I flew about a dozen of those trips to Mexico. Brian has just come back from a trip with his family to Mexico, so it was fun to compare notes on flying south of the border. Now here's that conversation with Brian Deere. Now let me tell you a little bit about Brian Deere. Brian started flying this past April and passed his private check ride in November. He now has over 200 hours total time and has flown across much of the western U.S. and more recently in Mexico in his Turbo 206. He's the co-founder of iCouch, a mental health technology platform, and he's helping his wife, Jessica, who's a student pilot, with a new skincare startup called Palo Alto Potions. Brian, welcome to the show. I'm excited to have you here.
Hey, it's great to finally get a chance to talk to you. It's really an honor to be on the show. Thank you.
Well, I am thrilled to talk to you because you have been pursuing something that was a passion of mine. I spent quite a while traveling in Mexico about 20 years ago, and I know that that's something that a lot of pilots here in the U.S. think about and kind of think, well, maybe it's too big a deal. I can't do it. Before we get into the details of your trip, how did you get interested in flying to Mexico, and what were some of the places that you visited?
Well, so my wife she was born in Mexico, so we have some family down there. And, I've always had kind of an adventurous streak. I lived in Asia, lived in Europe for a while. And to me, that's the whole point of getting an airplane and flying in it, is to go to these places that you wouldn't necessarily get to see if you flew commercial or even driving a car. And Mexico is kind of the closest thing to bush flying that we can get in this part of the world. So to me, it just kind of struck my adventure, but there was some family stuff that made that trip attractive to us.
Hey, you were down there over the Christmas holidays. How long did you spend there, and what were some of the places you went to?
So I was down about 2 weeks, 2.5 weeks, and we went down the first part of the trip. We went down the Pacific side through Baja. We stayed in Loreto, which is a really great place to eat seafood. The coast is just spectacular. And then from there, we crossed the Gulf of California over to Mazatlan, and then we ended up in this small strip just south of Guadalajara. It's a place called Lake Chapala. There's a private airstrip that's run by a flight club down there. And, I was pestering them for weeks to get permission to land. And finally, somebody answered me. And so they gave us the okay. So Lake Chapala is a region that's pretty popular with Americans and Canadian retirees. You go down there and it looks almost like a Florida suburb. However, it is still Mexico. So that was kind of the main place. So we were mostly on the western side of Mexico. We were planning on coming down the Atlantic side, Gulf of Mexico, but the weather just wasn't cooperating flying out to Texas. So we ended up doing the Baja route instead.
And I found navigating down Baja pretty straightforward. Did you do what I did, which was just keep the blue on the right?
Yeah, that was basically it. So I'm an instrument student now. So one of the things I like to do is use my VORs and practice all of that stuff. But really, it was unnecessary. You literally climb up to whatever your altitude is and just keep the blue on the left and then also on the right because it's so narrow. When you get up to altitude, it's you can't get lost in Baja.
No, you certainly can't. But fuel stops are pretty far and few between.
Yeah, there's some planning that has to go into that. And as you mentioned, I just got my license in November, so I'm a pretty low time pilot. And one of the concerns is that fuel stops were so spread out that if you needed to go to an alternate, you really didn't have the gas to get there in most cases, or at least the gas to get to a place that had fuel available. So it's a little bit on the edge of my comfort zone because I landed in a place called San Felipe, which is a great airport. But of course, there's a brutal crosswind when I get there. And I didn't really have the chance, in the Bay Area, if you can't land at one airport, there's 15 others within 5 minutes. Down there, if you can't land, you're kind of in a position of concern. So that was one of the challenges was planning the fuel stops to where I knew I had enough reserve to at least get back to where I came from. So you take your standard VFR, IFR fuel rules and then kind of multiply that by a Mexico factor.
Yeah.
And that was kind of how I did it. I tried to land with at least 25 or 30 gallons in the plane at all times just to account for those things.
Yes, for example, I remember we would actually phone ahead to Guerrero Negro, which is about halfway down there, because sometimes they had fuel and sometimes they didn't. So you really wanted to call ahead. And the crosswinds at San Felipe, boy, that's the one thing I always remember. Whenever people talked about San Felipe, they always talked about crosswinds.
So, like I said, I'm a low time pilot, pretty new. Luckily, I am flying a heavier airplane, the 206. This version of it has a 3,800-pound gross. So I try to fly it as loaded as possible because it gives you a bit more stability in the rougher winds. But I had probably a 15-knot direct cross when I was landing there, and I didn't have a lot of options. I couldn't really go to a neighboring airport. So it took every bit of my ability to land the plane safely. And luckily I did go over this stuff with my CFI before the trip, and we did do some soft field and some off airport practice and extreme crosswind stuff. So I felt within my abilities, but it can be intimidating when you pretty much have to land the plane.
So, what were some of your favorite moments of the trip that delighted you?
Oh, well, I think the best part was when we landed in San Felipe, we were one of the only planes there. I have 4 kids and I was traveling with 3 of them. And my daughter, she's the little miniature CEO of the family. And so she goes in to the immigration desk and she starts asking questions, and she speaks Spanish as well. So the immigration officer actually let her get behind the desk and do the passport stamps, which that's not something you'd ever see in the US. It was pretty cool. She sat in a chair and was stamping all the passports and doing all that. So that was a really nice moment that sort of showed the warmth of the Mexican people, even in the government office. And that's one of the reasons I love going down to Mexico, either flying my own plane or commercial. You always get little moments like this where there's just a real love of the fellow man out there. It was great. So that was one of I guess the better moments of the trip was just the arrival.
And I think that's probably also symbolic of just how things tend to be a little bit more casual and just a little bit more relaxed when you get south of the border.
Yeah, it's true. And the irony is that planning this trip, it seemed like a very complicated, scary, bureaucratic mess. But then the moment you cross into Mexico, you might as well be flying with a pina colada. It's really laid back and it's a lot less stressful than even flying around our local area.
Well, this is a good time to kind of transition to technicalities of getting in and out of Mexico. I think a lot of pilots seem to be afraid to fly in Mexico. Why do you think that is? And do you think those fears are warranted?
One of the big problems that I saw in my planning was that you read online forums and you have guys that have been there, 10 years ago, 5 years ago, 1 year ago, and all of them had different experiences. So when you read this collectively, it gets to be intimidating because 10 years ago, you needed to have insurance from a Mexican carrier. Then just recently, now you don't need to have it from a Mexican carrier. It just needs to be valid in Mexico. And the point is that you continually have this conflicting and overwhelming amount of information, which is why I'm glad to be, talking to you about this, because my experience recently, that's the reality down there now. Whereas stuff that you might have heard, a few years back maybe isn't true anymore. So the important thing is just if you're flying a legal airplane, you have the paperwork that you need to have, you're going to be just fine.
Well, so clearly planning ahead is critical, and it sounds like you did a lot of that. Tell us about some of the resources that you found that were helpful for you in planning the trip.
I think the best first stop for me was Rick Gardner's site, Caribbean Sky Tours. They have a handling service that they usually use for private jets and kind of the, upper crust flyers. And I was a little scared of the trip, so I thought of hiring him to be a handler. And I got him on the phone, and he essentially made it where that wasn't necessary. He kind of walked me through what the realities are on the ground out there. And then, of course, the Caribbean Sky Tour website has a lot of great resources. And then I think my favorite resource, though, is Baja Bush Pilots. There's a lot of trip reports. There's a lot of guys that fly down there all the time. And the Baja Bush Pilots, they seem to know what's going on. And they have a lot of services on the website that make it useful. And then finally, the AOPA site on Mexico is also a great resource. AOPA there's a bit of overkill. They write down more stuff than you might actually really need. But if you follow AOPA's guidance, you're not going to be wrong.
And I'll go ahead and put links in the show notes to all of the sites that you just mentioned there. My recollection is that years ago, Baja Bush Pilots actually had a book which had details about every airport down there. Is that still available?
Yeah, they have that book. I think the new edition is in print now. They're getting ready to release it. So I didn't bother with that book because ForeFlight had information on the runways, a lot of the information. There's phone numbers in ForeFlight. So it's pretty easy to get information, especially if you're flying to the airports that have fuel. If you're flying to some backcountry strip that isn't very popular, I think that book might be pretty helpful. But yeah, I didn't really need the book for that. I have the Jeppesen charts. I have, I had phone numbers. I knew, I did a lot of research on my own beforehand. But yeah, that Airports of Mexico book is somewhat legendary.
Well, let's talk a little bit about what you need to make sure you've got with you in the plane before you go. What do you have to have?
So really, as I said, if you fly a legal airplane in the U.S., you're going to have your airworthiness, your registration. You're going to have insurance typically. But flying to Mexico, you actually need a printed copy of the insurance that shows that it's valid in Mexico. And so I have normal U.S. insurance that is valid in Mexico, but I still went ahead and bought a policy through Baja Bush Pilots, and I think it might have been $100 to cover. And the cool thing about that is it gives you the policy page in English and Spanish. So the insurance page is really the thing they care about the most: airworthiness, registration, insurance. My plane is owned through my LLC, so I had a notarized letter saying that I could fly the plane that my LLC owns, but honestly, nobody ever looked at that letter. And then the other thing that they're doing now that's interesting is they're checking the FAA database on the registration. So they actually open the FAA website, they'll look up your tail number. So as long as your registration page is accurate, you're going to have a pretty easy time. One minor point of concern is that planes that have been used in Part 135 operations, if they've been used for 135 operations in the past, there's a good chance they might ask you about that, because flying Part 135 in Mexico is a very complicated thing. So you don't want to be coming in on a personal flight and they think it's a charter flight, because then you might get into some difficulties there. And I guess the other thing is your ELT needs to be the new 406 ELT. So the best way to do is carry your form from the national, the NOAA registration for your ELT. That's usually good enough. And then as far as radio station licenses and all that, honestly, no one asked me for them. They're easy to get, but they really didn't care.
Okay. And technically they're required. So just to be on the safe side, you might want to go ahead and bring that along. I was reading something very recently about unlicensed airports. This was specific to Baja. Now, it sounds like a lot of strips that people have gone into in the past there are not currently licensed. And I guess that's a fairly expensive, complicated process. Did you hear anything about that?
I've read through Baja that there were some airports that were not licensed, but honestly, the guys in the flight plan office in the Mexico Tower, when you're doing your flight plan, and we could talk about this later, when you're doing your flight plan, you just tell them the code of the airport, and they don't really check if it's a licensed airport or not. However, I would not fly into an unlicensed airport specifically because that could invalidate your insurance. So if you were to fly into a supposedly illegal airport, that could create a problem for you, although practically nobody's going to care. But I would definitely advise not flying into an unlicensed airport.
Yeah, and I think some of the airports people have gone into the past and think of as normal airports are not currently licensed. So that's why that's an important point. So tell us a little bit about ramp checks. What have you heard about those?
So I had a ramp check when I first landed in San Felipe. There was a guy from the Mexican equivalent of the FAA came out to the plane. He had a badge on. He looked well dressed and official. And what he did is he kind of did a pre-flight style inspection of my airplane. So he did a full walk around. He looked inside, just made sure that the airplane was not going to fall apart. And then he looked at my airworthiness registration. So he looked at all the documents that I was supposed to bring in the first place. He was just a little more thorough about it. A couple of things that they check is, do you have a fire extinguisher? I don't know if he checked this or not, but a first aid kit is a requirement. So I know he looked in the back of the plane for that. And, he also asked for my pilot's license. And interestingly, I still have my student pilot license. And then I have the piece of paper, the temporary airman certificate. He actually didn't even look at the thing that says I'm a pilot. He looked at the thing that said I'm a student pilot and didn't seem to care. They just need to write down some stuff and check the boxes. But the ramp check didn't take any extra time. It was kind of all in the flow of arriving. And it was pretty it was a non-event. I think if you're flying in there in kind of an older, maybe questionable airworthiness aircraft, maybe they'll give it a little more scrutiny. But honestly, it was no big deal. It was expected, and wasn't confrontational at all.
And at one point, you were flying over water. Any special requirements or things you need to bring along for that?
It's kind of the same rule for the U.S. If you're out of 50 nautical miles from shore, you need to have overwater equipment. So I had life vests in the plane. And then what I also did, I was especially paranoid because I had my 3 little kids on the plane with me. So what I did is I actually took off. This is from Loretto. I took off and climbed out over the land, got up to about 17,500. We were on oxygen. And then once I was stable in cruise, then I turned out over the ocean. So at any given point, I had about a 35-minute glide time, and I was probably only about 20, 30 minutes away from out of glide distance from shore. And then I also had the Garmin InReach. I know you've talked about that in the past. And the Garmin InReach was broadcasting, my position. I had, a friend of mine was doing flight following with that. And then another tip that's useful is I know VFR guys don't typically fly Victor Airways, but I try to always stay on Victor Airways, especially down there. Because if you get, you get into an issue, you could tell them that I'm on Victor 3, 35 miles from wherever. They're going to have a lot easier time to find you. And then finally, I had my kids in the back looking out the window trying to find ships. So we made a game out of it where they would point out ships in the water. And if we were to have a problem, well, that's going to be your first place to glide to. So really the overwater was of no consequence. It was easy. It didn't take a lot of time. But I would, definitely have some preparation and make sure your engine's well maintained.
Yeah, that's a really good point on ships. Years ago, flying over the Monterey Bay, I used to think, I'd head straight for shore. And then I realized, no, I'm going to head straight to the point where I'll be right in front of a ship and they'll run me over, hopefully.
Yeah, exactly. And also off that Monterey coast, you have a lot of cliffs. So even if you did make it to shore, you might make it into shore and hit the side of a mountain. So you have to essentially keep your wits about you when you're flying over water, and then use some common sense. Fly toward a ship. Stay on the Victor Airways. Try not to do any configuration changes while you're over the water, because maybe you accidentally lean the engine incorrectly and it stalls out, or there's a lot of things that can happen. So my suggestion is to get sort of like a stabilized approach. You do a stabilized crossing.
And your point about being able to report your position accurately because you're on Victor Airways, I think people may not realize that search and rescue in Mexico is not nearly as evolved as it is here in the U.S. Their equivalent of the Civil Air Patrol, I don't think is going to send out nearly as many people in planes looking for you if you go down.
Yeah, that's a fact. And if you're able to report an accurate position, Mazatlan especially, they have a search and rescue operation, but they're not going to do a grid pattern over the entire Gulf of California. They're going to look kind of where you last were. And if they don't find you, they're not going to have the resources to go out there searching for some general aviation pilot that went down in the sea. So you want to try to stack the deck in your favor. And it's also a good idea to use something like the Garmin InReach, because at the very least, somebody that cares about you can at least let people know where you are.
I like your comment about stacking the deck in your favor. I think that's my philosophy for risk management for every aspect of aviation. Just makes a whole lot of sense.
Definitely.
So let's talk about getting from the U.S. into Mexico. What's the process, once you're up in the air or even before? What do you have to file? What do you have to do? How do you get from the U.S. to Mexico?
It's pretty easy. I keep mentioning Baja Bush pilots because they've made this really simple. But one of the things you have to do is file this thing called an EAPIS, which is essentially a note that goes to both Mexico and the U.S. saying, this plane with these passengers, we're going to go to this place at this time. So it's essentially sending a manifest. So you send one to the U.S. Customs and you send one to Mexico, and you can file that through Baja, but there's also other sites that you can do this through. And then what happens is you'll get an email back from Customs that's within a few minutes that says you're cleared for this flight. Mexico, you don't get anything from them. You just, they just get it. And then once you leave the U.S. or before you leave it, you file a flight plan. And I used ForeFlight for this. And under the flight, I think it's flight rules or flight type, you set it as a DVFR flight plan. And that's all you have to do and activate the flight plan. And then you're going to cross over the border. And the border crossing was scary for me because I thought, okay, once I get out of, I flew through from Imperial County. And once I crossed over, I was fearful of, oh my gosh, what's the air traffic control in Mexico going to be like? And it was really just like a handoff in Northern California. They just said, contact Mexicali approach on whatever frequency. Have a good day. Check in with Mexicali. They say, hey, hi, welcome. Report when you're 10 miles south of the city. And that was it. And then you report, and then maybe 50 miles, you report again. And they'll tell you to do all this. You don't have to hope you get it right. They'll tell you. Then they'll switch you off to another frequency, and you check in with them. And you just kind of hop your way down, down Mexico. So yeah, it was pretty painless. There were no F-16s involved, and I flew pretty low over the border. I was at about 1,500 feet because crossing a border is pretty cool. So I was able to kind of look outside, and my kids were able to look and look into Mexico. It was really fun.
Now, you can't just pick any airport to land at when you first enter the country, right?
Yeah, you need to land at an airport of entry, which an airport of entry is really just an airport of entry. There's nothing really special about it, and it doesn't have anything to do with the size of the airport. But coincidentally, airports of entry generally also have fuel. So by landing at an airport of entry, you're killing two birds with one stone. You get to do your formalities, and then there's also gas. One interesting thing, if you look at a sectional chart near Mexicali, you're going to see a lot of these, little red circles all across the southern part of the border. These are just dirt strips for, there's probably 20 or 30 of them right in that area of Mexicali for purposes that, are unknown. But it is fascinating how many airports are down there. But you do want to plan to land at an airport of entry, which also tends to be the ones with fuel.
It also tends to be the ones with customs.
Correct. And we haven't really talked about the security aspects of flying in Mexico, because I know that's a big fear of a lot of people is, they hear about how dangerous it is down there. In my experience, there was not a single moment where I felt unsafe in the whole flight. However, if you were to land at some of these airports that are not exactly well-known airports of entry, you might be encountering some people that you may not want to encounter. So it's a good idea to stay at airports that you know about and that are, official.
Makes total sense to me. So let's talk a little bit about what you do as you're flying from airport to airport within Mexico. What's that like when you arrive at a new airport in Mexico?
It's a little more tedious than the US because in the US, we take it for granted. We could land anywhere we want, get gas, and immediately take off again, and nobody cares. You don't have to talk to anyone. When you land at a Mexico airport, one of the first things that you do is you're going to go into the administrative office and they're going to look at, fill out a flight plan. And the flight plan is essentially saying, here you are, and that's where you're going. And it's similar to the way a US flight plan works. You're going to say your time en route, fuel on board, all that stuff. And the officials will typically fill this out for you, or they'll help you fill it out. And then once you have that, you got to go get stamps from the people. You pay a small landing fee. They give you a stamp. If you get gas, you have to pay for that. And once you have the stamps that you need, they'll take that flight plan to the tower. They'll give you a copy, and then you go and take off. So I guess the only major difference is that before you leave, you have to have an approved flight plan. And that flight plan approval is pretty easy. Like there's no special requirements. It's just that you need a paper with a stamp on it. And then when you arrive at another airport, they actually don't care about your prior flight plan. That flight plan has been somewhat transmitted through the system. So when I land, Tower already knows that I came from a specific other airport. A lot of airports are going to give you squawk codes. They know what's going on. But one of the challenges is if you land at an uncontrolled field, you don't have a flight plan. And when you arrive from an uncontrolled field, you just have to explain that I arrived from this uncontrolled field. So in short, it's pretty simple. You just have to get a flight plan, and it is on paper.
And there were many times when I flew from non-towered airports to a towered airport in Mexico. And when we arrived, they would create the flight plan for us. And I always thought that was pretty ironic. It's like, wait a minute, the flight is done. Why are we now filing a flight plan?
Yeah, the flight plans down there are less like they are here in the US. The flight plans down there are more like to track the planes that have used the sky as opposed to any sort of search and rescue. So if you didn't show up to where you're supposed to, nobody's coming to look for you. So it's not at all like the US.
Now, there's one other big difference that I remember landing at airports in Mexico versus in the US. Often we would encounter young men that were carrying weapons.
Yeah, so every time you land, you're going to have a soldier come to the plane. And I'm used to Mexico. I've been there commercially many times. I've driven into Mexico, so I'm not really fazed by this. But I know someone that has never been to Mexico might be unnerved with this soldier coming out to the plane. All they're doing is they're writing down your tail number. They're writing down where you came from. They want to see your pilot's license. They're basically just keeping notes of who lands at what airport. And one interesting note is that if an airport has fuel on the field, they have to have soldiers on the field. So if there's an uncontrolled airport without fuel, you're probably not going to see the soldiers. And this is just a way to fight the criminal element that, likes to do bad things. This is all this is. So really, the soldiers are really just keeping track of who comes in and out. And one tip on that is the questions they ask are similar. So if you write out a little card beforehand saying, here's my registration number, here's where I'm coming from, the flight is for tourism, you could just hand them that card and they're very appreciative of that. But yeah, the soldiers were great. They shake your hand, call you captain. They're very pleasant and also reassuring.
Sure, provided you're a good guy, right?
Yeah, and that's one of the fun things about flying in a 206 is that plane is known for being involved in some less than savory operations. So when I fly in this shiny 206, it takes them a second before they realize, oh yeah, he's okay. And then my 3 kids spilling out onto the tarmac kind of allays any other fears they might have had.
Yeah, I think they probably enjoyed seeing you arrive.
Yeah, it was a show, and my kids are not shy at all. So they'll go up and talk to the soldiers and, basically just get in the way. So yeah, they're great.
So do you have any other general suggestion for flying techniques while you're in Mexico going from airport to airport?
So the most important thing in terms of actual flying skill is you should definitely be up on your crosswind technique because you don't have a lot of options for alternates. You could be coming into an airport and you see that there's a 10 knot, 12 knot crosswind component, and there's not a lot you can do about it. And of course, the smart person's going to check the weather before they go. However, the weather in 2 hours that it takes to get from one airport to another has changed. I mean, the active runway could have changed. A lot of things have changed. So no matter how prepared you think you are, when you get to that airport, that's your reality, and you essentially have no choice other than to try to land there. So I would, suggest spending time with a CFI, working on crosswind technique. Also, it's a good idea to work on your short field technique, maybe work on soft field, kind of your basic private pilot fundamentals, because you don't know, sometimes the condition of the runway is suspect. So you may have to use a little different technique than you would at SFO, for example. So that's one of the key things. Also, being aware of your fuel management. Your reserves are your life. You don't have a chance to just land at any nearby airport, because even if you land at something without fuel, how are you going to get fuel to your plane, over with a truck over 200 miles? Like, you're stuck. So you're going to be a lot more on your own out there. Also, it's a good idea to be up on your VOR skills. Every now and then I would have someone ask me to report crossing a specific radial at a specific DME, and you want to be able to do that. So that's really all there is with flying technique, is make sure the plane's prepared, make sure you're prepared, and then have some backups and be liberal with reserves.
And what about the air-to-air frequency? How could that have been used, or did you use it at all?
So there's not really direct flight following down there, but I was being passed from tower to tower as I flew, because I planned a route so I would be fairly nearby optional fields. However, there's also a frequency down there, like you mentioned, the air-to-air frequency. It's called the 5-finger frequency, because it's 123.45 is the radio frequency. And that frequency, I usually kept that monitored just like you would guard in the US. And that was extremely useful, because when I was leaving Mexico, there was some terrain issues with radio reception for one of the towers. And there were some United flights that were coming into that airport that were coming at a higher altitude. So I actually used the air-to-air to relay instructions or check-ins through the United flight. And the United Airlines guys were super great about that. I would just tell them, this was 56 Lima. I can't talk to Vallarta Tower. Can you pass on my position? And then they would, I would hear it then on the tower frequency that they would call it in for me. And then you'll hear a lot of Americans talking just air to air, just having conversations on that frequency. But yeah, my most important frequency was definitely the next tower that I was approaching.
I've heard you in the past talk about IFR rules being slightly different. I think you had a story about someone who got in a little bit of trouble.
Yeah, so it was interesting, because IFR down in Mexico, if you're under, I think it might be 18,000 feet, you have to be on a Victor airway. There are no such thing as direct routings under a certain altitude. There may be pilots that have gotten direct routings, but those aren't technically legal, at least according to the information that I've had. So one guy was flying down, and he was flying direct at 10,000 feet, and the tower, got mad at him, saying, you're not on the airway. Why are you flying like this? And he said that the prior tower had given him that clearance to fly direct. So as I mentioned, with safety of flying Victors down in Mexico, it's a very good idea to fly Victor Airways no matter what. There's plenty of them, and it's a good idea to fly the Victors, but IFR, it's a requirement. So that's kind of an interesting note. The other thing is, if you're into approaches, they do a lot of penetration turns.
Yeah, let me just jump in for a moment. Brian misspoke there. He meant procedure turns. And for folks who are not instrument pilots, the procedure turn, according to the Aeronautical Information Manual, is a maneuver prescribed when it's necessary to reverse direction to establish an aircraft on the intermediate approach segment or final approach course. Now, these are pretty common on a lot of older non-GPS approaches. If you're in radar coverage and talking to air traffic control, you can skip procedure turns by getting radar vectors. But if you're in an area with no radar coverage, you are required to fly the procedure turn if one is shown on an approach. And Brian describes those here.
So you'll fly out to the VOR station, then you'll turn back out, fly maybe 10 or 12 miles out from the airport, and then come in on the approach. So you'll see a lot of kind of strange to us approaches, but don't expect to fly RNAVs or any of the LPVs or any of the approaches that we're used to. Most likely you're going to be on a VOR approach.
Yeah, the last time I went into Ensenada, which has been, probably 16 years ago, They still had their NDB approach in effect, which was the only one, and that involved crossing the field, flying out over the ocean, then coming back inbound on the ocean. And the irony of the whole thing was that the MDA, the minimums on that approach, were typically higher than the stratus layer of clouds that were in there. So it was rarely helpful for getting into the airport anyway. And I think what people did instead is they would fly southeast of town where the clouds would start to dissipate, sneak under the clouds and come in that way. So sometimes you have to use kind of local methods to get into some of these airports.
Well, one good tip that I would advise, especially VFR pilots, is using the approach plates for, and this applies in the US too, but when you're flying into unfamiliar airports, especially in Mexico where there's not a lot of alternates, use the approach plates to brief your VFR arrival, because those approach plates will give you a good indication of nearby terrain. You can expect that you can fly something similar to that instrument arrival. And it's a good way to get out of potential trouble, because there were some airports that I flew into. One of them, I think, was Tepic, Mexico, and then Guaymas, Mexico. And those airports have terrain all around them. And when you're flying into those airports, you're looking around going, where's the runway? Is it in front of the mountain or is it behind the mountain? Even with GPS, it's still a bit unclear where that runway is. But if you've looked at these approach plates, you have a real nice briefing to help you get into these airports. So using the VFR, using the IFR charts to help your VFR flying is a tip that I can't really emphasize enough.
And did you use ForeFlight's new 3D view to help you kind of scout out what the territory looks like ahead of time?
I did. And I'm on these online discussions all the time where people talk about the merits of ForeFlight subscriptions. And I'm a big advocate, even for a new pilot, to use that subscription that gives you the 3D view. There were some airports where there was a 3D view, but it didn't actually have the runway information, but you could still get a nice 3D view of the area. But most of them did have the runways, which was very helpful to kind of see what to expect. But also remember that after the rainy season, it's going to look green. In your 3D view, it might look brown. So be sure to keep up with, use your common sense. But yeah, using 3D view is a great way to brief the approach. And then I also tended to come in a lot higher than I might have in the US. And that the reason for that is I don't know if somebody built a 200-foot tower the week before. Coming in at a higher angle, especially on the long runways, there's no embarrassment landing at the end of the first third of the runway if you have it, because then you're safe. So just be cautious with things like terrain clearance and the actual approach into the airport.
Yeah, I agree. I like the higher level performance plans within ForeFlight. I recently upgraded to the one which is at the $300 level, and I know that includes the 3D view and a number of other things that I found useful when flying the Vision Jet. What about VFR at night? Anything special there?
Yeah, you don't do it. So VFR at night is prohibited in Mexico, and it's actually a very good idea to not allow it in Mexico at night, because Mexico there are populated areas, but it's nothing like the US. You can go for miles and miles and not see a light, and then combining that with terrain. And then another problem is a lot of folks may not have the best charts for Mexico. So planning a precision VFR route through terrain gets a little more scary at night, because you don't have a lot of confidence that your information is correct. So yeah, essentially don't do it. You can fly IFR at night, but I would avoid that as well, unless you're flying, in the flight levels or in a jet. I wouldn't fly at night in Mexico at all. And it's mainly because there's a lack of lights. There's a lack of ability to see visual references on the horizon. So it can be a lot more dangerous than it would be in the U.S.
So let's talk about coming back into the U.S. How does one get from there to here?
So essentially you leave Mexico the same way you came in. You don't have to leave from the same airport, but you have to leave from an airport of entry. So if it has fuel, it's most likely an airport of entry, but check this before you go. But you land at the airport you're going to leave from, you go in, you're going to give them your permit, you're going to make out a new flight plan, you're going to pay immigration the exit fee, which I think for us it was about 300 pesos for 4 people. It wasn't very much at all. You pay your exit fee, then of course you get some stamps. They really like to stamp things. And then when you're on the ground in at the airport, before you leave, you're going to want, assuming you have a cellular connection, you're going to want to open your flight plan back to the US. And you can do this through ForeFlight, which is really great. So I filed a flight plan from Guaymas, Mexico to Yuma, Arizona. And then I opened the flight plan on the ground in Mexico. And of course, this is a DVFR flight plan. When you open that flight plan, now the U.S. knows that you're about to cross the air defense identification zone. The other thing that I did on the ground, which I found out was unnecessary, is I called U.S. Customs in Yuma to let them know our exact arrival time. And then finally, maybe the day before, you're going to fill out the E-APIS again, but this time for the entry into the U.S. So it's the same thing you did to enter Mexico, but in reverse. So you're going to give your list of passengers, and then you also need to give the time that you're going to cross the air defense identification zone. So one tip on that is I just used a radial from the Bard station north of Yuma, and I just told them I was coming in on the 155 radial, and I'll be crossing, 25 miles from the station. And then once I was in the air, I just flew to that radial and crossed at that exact moment. And then once I landed, piece of cake. You taxi over to the customs ramp. You park your plane in a big yellow circle. They come out to the plane, check your passport, and you're on your way.
That's an interesting point. You mean when you park in the circle, you can't just jump out of the airplane and run to the bathroom?
You could try that, but I think you might not get very far. Now, as I told you, my kids are a bit precocious, and my youngest boy, Oliver, he's 5 years old, so he doesn't really care much about the rules so much. So we got out of the plane, and of course he runs out of the yellow circle. The customs guy was real cool about it. And then you have to walk to the customs building to get your passports checked. And there's a red line that divides that customs secure area from the rest of the airport. And the customs guy said, don't cross the red line. And of course, my boy walks right on the red line the whole time, and then steps one step into the restricted zone. And he was just pushing the buttons of the customs guy, but they were really nice about it and had a good laugh.
Do they have 5-year-old size handcuffs?
No, but I did tell him that he was going to have to work off his fine or something. I can't remember what I said, but the customs guy was really, really cool about it.
Wow. All I could say is you're going to have your hands full in about 10, 15 years when this young man's a teenager.
Well, the cool thing is on the flight down, when I was in Mexico, there was a lot of time where it was just lonely, straight and level flight. So I had him up in the co-pilot seat, and I actually let him steer the plane for a bit. Obviously I was on the controls, but he's too short to see over the dashboard or the cockpit when, out the window. So he's watching the G1000, keeping the everything lined up and flying through the purple boxes. And yeah, every time we fly, he's asking, Daddy, can I fly today? So yeah, I think he's going to have a fun time when he's older.
I think we've got a future pilot in the making.
Yeah, I hope so. But that's another thing. Flying with kids is a bit of a different experience. A lot of our audience probably doesn't fly with little kids as much as they fly with older people. And the trick to that is really just, do short legs. Our maximum leg was about 3 hours, which is still pushing it. But make sure you have snacks on the plane, because a lot of these airports that you fly into, there's not even a vending machine. There's not even a water fountain. So if you're flying, down Baja, make sure you have some snacks on the plane for both you and your passengers. Carry water. Just be self-sufficient. Pretend like you're going camping in terms of loading up the airplane.
That brings back great memories. I remember taking volunteer doctors and dentists down to Mexico with Los Médicos Valadares, and it was pretty well established that people knew they were supposed to bring some chocolate chip cookies for the pilot. And if you started munching some of those about 20 minutes before you had to land, hey, you know what? You were absolutely on your game and in great shape. So yeah, those snacks are important, not just for the kids.
Yeah, and you bring up a good point, because on the way back, I flew from Mazatlan all the way to Palo in one day, which was probably about 12 and a half hours on the Hobbs meter, which was a little longer than normal. But, make sure you're paying attention to things like pilot fatigue, the standard risk management that you would use. Just because you're flying south of the border doesn't, absolve you of the rules and the way you normally fly. So, make sure you eat something. If you're sick, don't fly. kind of the standard rules, but they're more critical down there because if you get into trouble, you're a lot further away from any kind of help. And it's actually an interesting story when we were flying back. So we had just arrived from Yuma and then we flew to Bakersfield and there was a pilots and pause request. So we picked up this dog from a shelter at the Atlantic Aviation FBO and flew him to Palo. So it was quite a day. We got to come back and do something good for an animal and arrive safely back from Mexico.
Well, about the only thing I can say, young man, is these 12-hour days, you might want to consider having some duty limits for yourself. That's pushing it a little bit.
Yeah, this was pushing it. The reason we did this is I promised the kids an extra day in Mazatlan, so at the beach, so they could kind of relax. I just was planning on stopping, but I just kept feeling good. I didn't feel tired, and I felt like I could keep going. So yeah, I was pushing it a bit, but you got to know your limits. It's not you don't want to be unsafe. But I was more tired and frustrated being on the ground than I was actually flying the airplane. So I felt happier up there. But of course, in the days before, I made sure I had plenty of rest. I avoided alcohol probably 48 hours before the flight. We were eating well. We were sleeping well. I wouldn't normally push the time that much. But, if you are going to fly longer than you should, just make sure you're healthy. And Mexico is a real easy place to drink a lot of great alcoholic drinks, but avoid it completely before you fly and, take care of yourself. That's probably one of the best pieces of advice because it's tiring going through the airports and doing all the papers and, dealing with kids. So, make sure you're taking care of yourself.
I think that's really good point. I totally agree with you on the need for rest. It also makes a heck of a lot of sense to stay away from the alcohol, certainly toward the end of the trip. I think there are times when people climb into the plane and they're exhausted from their vacation, which is kind of ironic. So yeah, you definitely need to plan ahead. Now, I'm curious, how long did it typically take to do the paperwork when you would arrive at an airport? And what was the longest amount of time that it took?
So that's a great question. And we also didn't really talk much about the fueling process, and this is all related. So I counted on about an hour per stop as my goal. Some airports, I was able to get out of there in 25 minutes. It was really efficient. Like, for example, in San Felipe and the entry, I think I was there a total of about 40 minutes. And that included the immigration entry, the customs, and all of that. One of the things that's a great idea is when you land, immediately ask somebody about fuel. And most of the airports will have trucks. Get the fuel guys on their way as soon as you possibly can, because the times where I did have a delay, I think we were on the ground about an hour 15. It was because the fuel truck guys were off doing something else. They were fueling an airliner or something that took them a while. So yeah, I would count on about an hour on the ground. And you can probably get out of there in 30 minutes. But the key limiting factor there is how fast the fuel truck can get to you. So yeah, don't plan the trip with 15-minute stops. You're not going to make it. But yeah, about 30 minutes to an hour, and you should be good.
Now, Brian, you had made a very generous offer to let people get in contact with you if they had any questions about flying in Mexico. How do they do that?
Kind of in the tradition of aviation news talk where we're here to serve pilots and help each other out, I thought, well, maybe people have some questions. So you can reach out. I set up an email at mexico@icouch.me. So if anybody's planning a trip down there or just wants to chat, I'm happy to set up a phone call or exchange emails just to, provide any insight. If anybody has any questions. I'm not the most experienced pilot out there, but, I do know a few things from this recent trip. So feel free to reach out to me if anybody has any questions.
Well, Brian, Mexico clearly is a fun flying destination. Thanks so much for sharing all your experiences with us today.
Oh, it was really a lot of fun. It's an honor to be on the show. Thank you.
Well, it's easy to get excited about flying in Mexico, and my thanks to Brian for coming on the show and sharing his knowledge about flying south of the border. And I've posted links to all of the Mexico flying resources we talked about. Just go out to our show notes. You'll find these in the Apple Podcast app or in our dedicated Aviation News Talk apps for iOS and Android. Just swipe up on your phone while you're listening to this show. Or on the web, go out to aviationnewstalk.com. And that's the same place to go to send me an email with any feedback or to record a listener question you'd like to have answered on the show. Just go to aviationnewstalk.com and click on Contact or Listener Question at the top of the page. And please don't forget to tell your friends about this show. That's really how most people learn about it. So help us out there. When you run into friends of yours that are interested in aviation, tell them about the Aviation News Talk podcast. And yes, some of those folks won't know what a podcast is, so just send them out to the Apple App Store or the Google Play Store to download our dedicated Aviation News Talk podcast apps for iOS and Android phones. In the App Store, search for Aviation News Talk. And yes, those apps are totally free. So until next time, fly safely, have fun, and keep the blue side up.